this supposed third grader was actually completely unable to read anything, including the word dog. So
he was in third grade getting B's and C's and could not read the word dog. How did educators miss that?
I think sadly it's more common than not.
Wow. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Undoctrination. My name is Maggie, and my wonderful co-host and friend Olivia is not here this week, but do not worry, it is not just going to be me today. I am joined by an incredible guest, Kerry McDonald. Welcome to the show. We are so lucky to have you. I'm so excited to get into this conversation.
It's so great to be with you, Maggie. Thank you so much.
Of course, of course. And if I could just take 1 second to read out your bio, because it is literal goals. Like, I want to be you when I grow up. So Kerry is a senior education fellow at FEE and host of the weekly Liberated podcast. She is also the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside of the Conventional Classroom. In addition to her role at FEE, Kerry is also the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at State Policy Network, an adjunct scholar at Cato Institute, and a regular Forbes contributor. What? Her research interests include homeschooling and schooling alternatives, self-directed learning, education entrepreneurship, parent empowerment, school choice, and family and child policy. Her articles have appeared in 5 million places, which is amazing, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, Washington Examiner, City Journal, Entrepreneur, and the Journal of School Choice, among others. And she has a master's degree in education policy from where? Harvard University. And a bachelor's degree in economics. Kerry lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her husband and 4 children. You have a lot going on, and seriously, I mean it when I say, like, you are such an inspiration. You have a beautiful, big family, and recently you've been traveling around the United States. What have you been doing this past spring?
It's been really exciting, Maggie. I was given the opportunity to visit a lot of places around the U.S., but specifically 5 cities to focus on education entrepreneurship, sort of these hubs of innovation and entrepreneurial parents and teachers who are creating exciting new learning models, kind of unconventional, out-of-system learning models. These would be things like microschools and low-cost private schools and homeschooling collaboratives and hybrid schools and coaching and tutoring services, all kinds of different models that enable more and more families to exit an assigned district school, even in states where there may not be robust school choice policies that enable education funding to follow students. We're seeing this entrepreneurship happen everywhere. And it was really exciting to be able to meet these education entrepreneurs and put together a new case study that was just released at FEE, at the Foundation for Economic Education, that was co-sponsored by FEE and Stand Together, that really highlights these bottom-up education solutions. It's so inspiring.
Yeah, and I feel like, so a lot of these occurred in places without robust school choice policies, which kind of embraces this thing called permissionless innovation. So even if the system isn't designed to help you do things, sometimes it's just worth going out and creating the world you want to live in. What specific cities did you focus on?
Yeah, let me just back up for 1 second and just say that this permissionless innovation is happening even in places like Florida, where there are robust school choice policies. I think about South Florida in particular, where I also did a case study last fall, kind of the greater Fort Lauderdale area, where there's another cluster of education entrepreneurship, and most of those entrepreneurs are welcoming students into their programs who are attending tuition-free, or at least with subsidized tuition from, at the time, the tax credit scholarship program in Florida, and now Florida just passed a universal ESA, so there'll be more of that. So certainly school choice policies help, but they're not a requirement for this education entrepreneurship to happen, and that's what I was able to find in the five cities or states that I visited over the past 5 months. And it was New York City,
Wow.
Richmond.
New York City?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Richmond, Virginia, the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas, Detroit, Michigan, and this rural corner of Southern Oregon, about 4 hours from Portland. So 5 areas where there really isn't robust education choice policy, and yet flourishing entrepreneurship and founders who are really committed to creating individualized, learner-centered models that are accessible to families. So they all tend to be very low cost, a fraction of the cost of other kind of private traditional schools, but really focused on that kind of learner-centered education.
That's so interesting. The cities and places you listed off don't really seem to have much in common. So it's fascinating that these particular areas were where they had clusters of educational entrepreneurship. What do you think was the moment that sparked these entrepreneurs' interest in creating new systems?
Yeah, well, I will say, too, that these 5 areas were sort of places that we picked because we thought that they were interesting. They were sort of different, diverse models, interesting founders. But these clusters of education entrepreneurship are happening everywhere. So I could pick 5, additional cities, and I may do that and find, again, 5 clusters of education entrepreneurship. So, but I think what these founders are doing in these areas and what I'm seeing across the country is that they're, like all entrepreneurs, these education entrepreneurs, many of whom, the vast majority of whom are former public school teachers, are really fed up with the standardized one-size-fits-all model of government-run schooling. And they have the tenacity to say, I think I can do things better. And so they go off and create an education solution that is attracting scores and scores of families in each of these communities. And so it's really exciting to just see what they're building through their own ingenuity and perseverance.
Oh my gosh, I have so many questions about this. Okay, because I know that during COVID, a lot of parents pulled their children out of these traditional schools. I know for my family, I have 2 really young sisters, which not a lot of people know about me because I'm 24 and they're like under 10. But they both were in public schools at the time. And my very young sisters were sat in front of laptops for hours and hours and hours a day learning online, which for even adults is nearly impossible. So I know that must have been a catalyst for a lot of these schools. Have you noticed any trends regarding COVID? Who exactly is taking their kids out of schools and why?
Absolutely. It's really interesting. You mentioned my book, Unschooled, that came out in 2019, that really highlighted sort of the growth and increased momentum in education alternatives and innovative learning models that are outside of traditional public or traditional private schools. So, I kind of cataloged the growth over the first couple of decades of the new millennium in microschooling and homeschooling and the diversification of both of those things. And then, of course, COVID hit. And so, as Milton Friedman once said, what are the ideas lying around that take hold in the wake of a crisis? The ideas lying around in education were certainly these sort of out-of-system entrepreneurial models of education, along with, of course, school choice. And we've seen a growth in both of those areas over the past 3 years of education disruption. And I think really it just, the response to COVID, the school shutdowns, the remote learning, all of that really just accelerated this trend that had been gaining traction over the previous couple of decades. And so parents realized when they were home with their kids in the spring of 2020, that there were other ways to approach teaching and learning. And so I think it really not only opened up a lot of families' eyes when they were actually able to see through Zoom schooling what was happening in their children's classrooms, but it also sort of jolted them to say, oh, the district school that I've been assigned is not my only option. And in fact, there's other possibilities. And then it also jolted more entrepreneurial parents and educators to meet that demand from parents by creating more of these options. And I think we're just still seeing that. I can give you an example of one of the entrepreneurs who's in the case study, and there's 35 entrepreneurs in these 5 cities that are spotlighted in the case study. One of whom is Bernita Bradley from Detroit, Michigan, who had been an education advocate for a number of years. And when the school shutdowns hit Detroit, she started working with a handful of families, about a dozen families, who decided that they wanted to approach homeschooling, which was not something that actually Bernita had been actively involved with or in any kind of deliberate way. I mean, she was focused on lots of different options for families, but not specifically homeschooling. But she was seeing the ramifications of remote learning, particularly for families in Detroit, and offered to provide support for these homeschooling families that were kind of new to homeschooling as a result of COVID. Well, sure enough, of course, schools have all reopened. Things are relatively back to normal. That one program that she started called Engage Detroit in 2020 with 12 families now serves more than 100 families, almost 250 students throughout the city of Detroit, of all families who are, again, like these teachers, fed up with this schooling status quo and are taking, efforts and charting their own path to creating an education program for their kids that's much better than anything that they would be getting in conventional schools. And they're doing it in a really collaborative way. This isn't sort of traditional homeschooling in any way. This is really a much more kind of community-based, collaborative process that involves all kinds of different, teachers and partners throughout the city. So just exciting to see.
So with that homeschooling collective, that started out as a micro school, right? Because could you define the term micro school? What exactly does that entail? How does it show up? Because I've been through many different educational systems. I was in public school, private school. I did homeschooling online, but I never went to a micro school. So what exactly is that?
So, I think it's important to let the founders kind of self-identify and self-define what their programs are. But the way I usually talk about microschools are intentionally small, typically mixed age learning communities, very low cost, with hired educators, often in a leased space. So that would differentiate it maybe from a learning pod, which could be, again, with hired educators, but is usually, fewer than 10 students. And usually it takes place in someone's home. A microschool is usually outside of the home with hired educators and could be, anywhere from, say, 25 to 100 students. But the key is that it's really a focus on kind of individualized learning, mixed age environments, mastery-based learning, kind of challenging, again, what we think about the conventional learning models. And often, too, microschools, they could either be set up as a recognized K-12 private school, but often, this kind of gets back to your point about permissionless innovation, and something that I write extensively about in my Unschooled book, is they could be kind of full-time schooling alternatives for families who are legally identifying as homeschoolers to give them that freedom and flexibility, but they could be sending their kids to one of these microschools part-time, a few days a week, up to full-time, 5 days a week, as a full-time schooling alternative, again, at a fraction of the cost of traditional private schooling with a much more bespoke kind of educational approach.
That's amazing. And I think that trend is only going to increase. My generation is definitely the one that bucks against conventions. I'm sure that's been true for many past young generations, but especially to people that I've talked to, and especially during COVID, a lot of us started thinking about what we want to do for our future children, and micro schools have been very, very popular among us. Something you said was quite interesting, the mixed age element, because the grouping of people together with the same age, that kind of came out of the Prussian school system, right? But that's not how it always was. What kind of benefits come from the mixed age system? Because we all grew up with the same ages being around us, and so we think that's kind of the way to do it. What is the benefit of having all of these different ages in the same classroom?
Well, you're right that the sort of age-segregated model of mass schooling came out of the Prussian model and was imported into the common school movement led by Horace Mann in the mid-19th century here in the U.S. And it's really just artificial, right? Like, how often do you only spend time with other 24-year-olds? It's sort of
Never.
not
I
in the
know
real world.
only a few. Yeah.
And more likely, we spend time with people who have shared interests. We, kind of learn from each other, people who are more experienced. We, kind of help guide and mentor people who are young, less experienced, and so on. And so I think this idea of mixed age learning is just more authentic and more the kind of the ways that humans would naturally interact. I'll give you an example of what it looks like, though, in practice, and kind of one of these entrepreneurs who are in the case study. Danette Buckley runs a microschool in a low-income community just outside of Richmond, Virginia. She's a former public school teacher, taught in the Virginia public schools for a number of years. She ended up pulling her kids out to homeschool them. She had a little pod that included 3 of her kids and 1 other student. But now she has 30 students, 4 teachers, and it's K-12. Hers is a recognized private school. So unlike the kind of homeschool model, hers is actually a private school. That's a fraction of the cost of other traditional private schools. It's $4,600 a year for students to attend.
That is not bad. That is not bad at all.
Right.
We're paying like $13,000 per student in Louisiana right now. That's where I'm from. So I just know that off the top of my head, but that is really not bad for tuition.
It's not bad at all, and it's quite consistent with what I'm seeing in terms of these microschools and similar models. They tend to be purposefully low cost. And again, Virginia does not have robust school choice policies, but Danette works hard to make her tuition as accessible as possible. She does a lot of grant writing. She does fundraising. She does sliding scale tuition to offset the cost even further for families that could benefit from it. Anyway, she tells a story of one student who came to her program called Dream Tech Academy back in August of 2022. The child was in 3rd grade in the local public schools, was getting B's and C's on his report card. And so, technically fine, but the mom just felt like something wasn't right, had that sort of motherly intuition that something is not adding up here. And so sure enough, she enrolled her son into this microschool. And Danette did her initial kind of take-in assessments of standardized testing and discovered that this supposed 3rd grader was actually completely unable to read anything, including the word dog. So
he was in 3rd grade getting B's and C's and could not read the word dog. How did educators miss that?
I think sadly it's more common than not.
Wow.
And so the mom was right? Her intuition was right that something wasn't adding
poor
up.
Baby.
Well, what's great about this microschool and this individualized approach to learning and mastery-based learning, so it's not based on, A to F. It's whenever you learn it, you'll move on to the next step. And so, sure enough, within just a few weeks of a much more tailored system of learning, this young boy was catching up. He was really starting to learn how to read and was, having success with that and really being able to show progress. And the thing that Danette said that was so great about this mixed age environment, this mixed age mastery-based environment, is that even though this boy was doing sort of kindergarten level curriculum, obviously, because he didn't know how to read, there wasn't any of that sort of social stigma or sense that he was somehow behind his peers because everyone is working exactly where they are meant to be. And that includes advanced students who are working well above what would be their typical grade level.
That is so interesting. That kind of reminds me of society, like school. We read a lot of dystopian fiction in school. I was a gifted student, so I would go to this gifted kids camp, and we read a lot of dystopian fiction. And one thing that was really common in dystopian literature is that everyone's assigned jobs, right? And it honestly reflects the way our modern school system works, is that we want to neatly categorize people in certain ways, and everyone has to master everything in order to be considered a like good student. And that just doesn't seem to be the way the real world works. So it's kind of incredible that these new models of education are able to give students the freedom and ability to kind of work at their own pace and actually master skills before having to move on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really moving from mass schooling to micro schooling, kind of in its broadest terms. Of mass schooling is a sorting mechanism, right? I mean, it's saying, okay, who are the A students, who are the F students, and essentially doing what you're saying in these dystopian sense of this is your path in life based on these grades. And what the push toward these more individualized micro models of education are doing is saying, no, each individuals should be able to flourish, and they should be able to use a curriculum approach and a teaching and learning strategy that enables them to learn content in the way that's right for them in the time that's right for them, and not be sorted, again, according to the sort of mass schooling mindset. So I think that's what's most exciting, is that it's really looking at each individual learner. And of course, technology is a big benefit for that. I mean, now we're able to really use technology to personalize education and to meet each child where they're at.
Yes, let's get into technology, because I think it was a few months ago that you published a piece about screen time. And another popular trend among my generation is that we all say, oh, I would never give my kid a screen. And I'm kind of that way too, because I'm like, oh goodness, I know how, addicted I am to my own phone. So I've always thought, okay, I'm not giving my own child like an iPad or a phone. But from what you've talked about, that might not be the right way to handle the emergence of new technology. So what are your thoughts and feelings?
Well, I'd encourage your listeners and viewers also to look into the work of Peter Gray, who's a psychology professor at Boston College. He wrote the foreword to my book. He also wrote a book called Free to Learn. And he is the one who I think is probably the most articulate on this topic. One of the things that he says is that technology, computers, and all of their iterations are the most important tool of our culture. So he would say denying our children access to these tools, even for play and even in sort of a recreational fashion, would be equivalent to, hunter and gatherer families denying their children access to bows and arrows. I mean, these are the most important tools of the culture. And so I think a lot of these fears are sort of overblown. And I also think that they mask the real issue. Sometimes families will look at their children's use of technology, or that they're on social media all the time or playing video games all the time, and they'll say, see, this is why these technologies are destructive, when often it's that young people are either denied access to kind of our broader culture in meaningful, authentic ways. I mean, we see labor force participation, for example, among teenagers is at record lows.
Really?
Yeah. So
I did not know that.
There's that piece. There's sort of like, what else do you expect them to do? We're kind of denying them access through minimum wage laws and various other policies that can often prevent teens from kind of meaningfully connect with the wider world. But also, today's young people are spending so much more time in school and school-like settings, starting at ever younger ages and extending far later into adolescence, including after school time. And again, these sort of school stuffs that take up a lot of their time. And so, of course, when they're not having every moment of their day scheduled, they're going to retreat into something that gives them some autonomy, like a video game, or some area where they're able to kind of manifest their own destiny through play. And so again, let's look at the kind of wider issues here. The technology may not be the problem; it may be a reaction to a wider problem.
I have never thought of it as a reaction for like a search for more autonomy, because I've also thought of it as maybe they aren't being paid enough attention. Like that's also causing issues with teenagers these days. But that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Well, and also, I mean, and Lenore Skenazy writes a lot about this. She's at Let Grow. She wrote the book Free Range Kids. I mean, she talks about how, kids today spend all of their time kind of supervised and in structured activities. Mm-hmm. They're not allowed typically to engage in free play, certainly the kind of play that I had as a child where we sort of roamed the neighborhood in the afternoons. Mm-hmm. Freely without adult supervision, without cell phones. And that's really disappeared as again, there's much more of a focus on structured supervised activities. And, I think a real dismissal of the importance of free play and unstructured time for kids. And so again, what do kids do in that environment when they're not encouraged to be out with a gaggle of kids in their neighborhoods? Mm-hmm. They retreat into technology, into computers and smartphones.
Do you think the fear that plays into not letting children roam and do all of those things? I actually grew up like that too. I grew up in the country, and so there wasn't a lot of fear around letting us out of the house. So we would explore and go play in the woods, and my parents were not concerned about us at all. And I actually learned responsibility that way because I had to know how to get us home. But do you think the fear that goes into not allowing your children to go and take risks also translates into a reason a lot of people are choosing these standard models of education? Because I've wondered that if, people's dismissal of homeschooling and microschools and these alternative forms of education comes from a fear of like the unknown or judgment from other parents. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I feel like the trend now is sort of the opposite, right? Like these homeschooling and microschooling are ascendant. We're moving from the sort of early adopter stage to a kind of an early majority stage.
Wow.
And I think a lot of that is because standardized schooling has reached a breaking point. A lot of families are dissatisfied with the one-size-fits-all model. And then you also see on kind of all sides of the ideological spectrum, families saying, this school isn't reflecting me. The curriculum here is not what I want for my kids. And again, that spans kind of politics and partisanship. And families just say we can do things better. And so I think that we're really moving into a moment where families are much more open to personalized, innovative educational options. And I think a lot of that, frankly, has to do with technology in its sort of broader cultural sense, that we have so much personalization in every other part of our lives. We look at our smartphones and all of our personalized apps, and yet we don't have anything near that level of personalization or customization in K-12 education. And I think parents are fed up with that. And I think, certainly young people like in your generation are saying, this is not what I want for my kids. This is archaic, which it is. And we want something that's much more reflective of the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think for us, the schooling experience was so recent, and we know in how many ways we were failed by this model of schooling. So I think that's why it's such a popular thing among my generation to say, okay, I'm going to embrace a different way for my kids. What's super interesting, really quick, I wanted to make this comment. So I was talking about my sisters. They went through school online during COVID, and my parents, my stepmom, I love her so much. She is very liberal, right? And so I never thought I would see the day when she called me and told me that she was homeschooling my little sister. Like, it was genuinely shocking to me because maybe 5 years ago, that was not a very popular thing. Like, most homeschool families were seen as backwards and regressive and hyper fundamentalist. But it's really encouraging to see so many new people embrace homeschooling because it really is adaptable to what your family needs, So speaking of people kind of bucking against the trend in K through 12. I know that your main focus is K through 12, but I have been on this kick of being very upset with colleges because I've been thinking about going back to college, and how colleges are really one size fits all. Do you think that we may see a trend in the future of colleges embracing old and new forms of education that are different from the standard core curriculum?
I hope so. I mean, we do see glimmers of that. I think about the University of Austin, the new kind of competitor to traditional higher education. I'm not seeing it as much in higher education. I'm not seeing this push toward innovation and decentralization in higher ed as much as I'm seeing in K to 12. But perhaps that's because there has been progress over the past couple of decades in higher ed with online schooling and kind of different ways of modularizing higher education that we just haven't seen in K to 12. But it's still ripe for disruption. It's still, kind of heavily one size fits all in a lot of ways. And I think that there's still room for entrepreneurs, but it's harder to break into. I think that accreditation tends to be a real gateway, more so in higher ed, even than in K to 12. So there are those barriers, but I'm hopeful. What do you think?
I genuinely hope we see some disruption. The University of Austin, that is Barry Weiss's university.
It's Barry Weiss and a whole team of, I think, like-minded folks. Yeah,
that's amazing. Yes, I hope things continue moving in that direction for sure. I did want to ask if you're comfortable with answering. So you have 4 children. What kind of model of education have you embraced with them, or is it kind of different based on what the child wants or needs?
Yeah, so my Unschooled book sort of goes through the education for my kids. None of them have ever been to a traditional school. They've always been unschooled. Up until COVID, they were all unschooled as a form of homeschooling. They attended a microschool a couple of days a week. That was in our city, as I mentioned, or as you mentioned. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We had, kind of a vibrant homeschooling community throughout the city. And then we experienced our own disruption caused by COVID with the city kind of shutting down and the microschool shutting down for an extended period of time, and then imposing various COVID policies with which we disagreed. So we had to look elsewhere. And one of the chapters in my Unschooled book is dedicated solely to the Sudbury model of schooling, kind of unschooling schools. And so Sudbury Valley School was founded in 1968. It's the original Sudbury model school focused on self-directed democratic education, non-coercion. There's no adult-imposed curriculum. There's no required classes. There's no grades or evaluation. It's young people ages 4 to 18, kind of mixed age environment. It's quite a distance outside of the city, which is why we had never considered it for our own kids. But again, with the disruption caused by COVID, we made our own shift and enrolled our 3 younger kids at Sudbury Valley, which has just been such a gift. And now, I can't imagine going back to anything else. It's been a perfect spot for us. And then my oldest daughter, who's 16, she, during COVID, again, this disruption caused by COVID, started taking some online classes and really loved that. So she's still homeschooled, but she does a full high school curriculum through Arizona State University, ASU Prep Digital, which is an online high school program that's tuition free if you're an Arizona resident, because Arizona, of course, leads the country in education choice and education innovation, but it's also quite low cost for families outside of the state.
That is so interesting. I, around her age, transitioned to doing online high school. And that was such a gift. Like it really, it allowed me to finish high school early, which was pretty cool. So I can now say that I finished high school early, but even still, like I got to move to a new city and did my high school in coffee shops before it was cool. So yeah, that's.
Yeah. And still have that freedom and flexibility that we love about homeschooling, where, you know, she's a black belt in martial arts. So she spends a lot of time in the martial arts studio and she works part-time. We're sort of bucking that trend of the teen labor force participation. So she loves to do that. So just being able to again, kind of customize a life that is similar to, you know, what you and I do. You know, we're able to have that freedom and flexibility, thankfully, in our adult lives. And again, what a special gift to be able to grant that to our children.
Absolutely. And just before we go, so we've mentioned the term unschooling or unschooled many times. Can you explain what that means? Because I think that's probably a new term for a lot of people.
Yeah, so the way I define it in my book is separating schooling from education, schooling from learning, including school-at-home versions of homeschooling. And this would be including school-at-home versions of microschooling, is not importing this sort of standard system of course of schooling into a home environment or into a smaller school environment. It's really saying, you know, we can separate education from schooling in a real meaningful way. And so what that looks like in terms of the learning centers and microschools and homeschooling families that I talk about in my Unschooled book is really embracing this idea that we are natural learners, that all young children are naturally curious.
Yes.
They're always asking why. They are incredibly creative. And that doesn't just stop when a child hits 5 or 6 years old and heads to kindergarten or first grade. It stops because of this kind of top-down coercive system of schooling that sends a message that, you know, creativity and curiosity are liabilities, that, you know, that conformity is valued more than originality. And for unschoolers or people who believe in sort of self-directed, non-coercive education, the idea is just not to turn off those kind of natural drives for curiosity and discovery that all young children exude, but to cultivate that, to facilitate that, and recognize that curiosity and creativity will carry through childhood and adolescence into adulthood if we just allow it to do that. And so that's where, again, these learning centers and microschools and Sudbury model schools, like I mentioned, really do that. But I will just sort of add one other piece to that the case study that just came out at FEE focuses on a wide assortment of educational philosophies and approaches. So some of the entrepreneurs I interviewed would kind of adopt this unschooling or self-directed education model, but many do not. And I think that's actually one of the great benefits of the current education entrepreneurship movement and these unconventional models is they're incredibly diverse in every way. Not only are their founders diverse, but their educational methodologies are diverse. So there's really something for every family's individual needs and preferences.
That's amazing. Before we go, I wanted to ask you, is there any piece of advice that you can give parents who are curious about these different systems of education and kind of where to start when looking for alternative solutions?
Well, at a high level, I'd love to encourage folks to read my new case study at fee.org/liberated and listen to my twice weekly podcast where I interview these education entrepreneurs about the programs that they're building. So that would be a kind of on a macro level. On a micro level, you know, I think it's really helpful for families to search up social media groups, Facebook groups, parenting groups in their communities and say, hey, I'm looking for an alternative education model or an unconventional program or maybe a microschool. And I think that these parents would be surprised to discover just what's available in their own backyards that they may have no idea existed, and that there's this whole ecosystem of decentralized, individualized education options that are very often financially accessible, again, even in states without school choice policies.
That's awesome. And let's go ahead and wrap up. Kerry, where can we find you? Like, where can people follow you?
Yeah, so please go to fee.org/liberated. There you'll see a link to the case study, a link to my podcast, various articles at Fee. You can also follow me on Twitter at Kerry, KERRY_EDU.
Awesome. And thank you so much for joining us this week. You guys can find me as usual on Twitter at Liberty Anders. Make sure to like, hit subscribe, leave us a comment, and we'll see you next week. Bye, guys.